The Tuskegee Syphilis experiment did not begin in secrecy. It unfolded in public, under the authority of the federal government, within the pages of medical journals, and in partnership with one of the most respected Black institutions in America. This was not ignorance. This was not an accident. And it was never inevitable. For 40 years, a government study allowed Black men to suffer and die from a curable disease, not in the shadows, but in plain sight. Built from philanthropy, racial science, institutional loyalty, and moral compromise, Tuskegee wasn't a failure of medicine. It was a decision. And understanding how it happened forces us to ask a harder question. How many people had to agree for this to continue? This is the History Podcast. I'm Jason Thomason. Let's get started. In 1895, Booker T. Washington rose to national prominence with his Atlanta Cotton States and International Exposition address, a speech that defined Black leadership in the post-Reconstruction South for a generation. Speaking before a predominantly white audience of industrialists, politicians, and philanthropists, Washington urged African Americans to prioritize economic self-sufficiency, vocational training, and industrial education over direct political confrontation or demands for social equality. His argument was explicit. He said, "The opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house." Washington framed labor, discipline, and patience as the practical path forward for people facing lynching, disenfranchisement, and legal segregation. Political power, he suggested, would eventually grow out of economic usefulness. This message deeply reassured white elites. As historian Lewis R. Harlan argues, Washington's philosophy created a racial peace formula, one that promised social stability in exchange for Black restraint. By publicly rejecting agitation, Harlan says that Washington reassured white industrialists that Black advancement would not threaten the racial or political order of the New South. But that reassurance came at a cost. Washington's approach narrowed the acceptable boundaries of Black leadership, privileging accommodation over confrontation and respectability over resistance. Leaders who challenged segregation directly, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, were often marginalized or attacked as irresponsible or dangerous. Founded in 1881, Tuskegee Institute became the institutional embodiment of Washington's philosophy. By the turn of the 20th century, Tuskegee had grown into a national training center for Black teachers, especially for rural Southern schools. It also became an economic anchor in Macon County, employing hundreds and shaping local development. But it was also a broker of interracial cooperation, linking Black communities with white philanthropists, industrialists, and government agencies. Tuskegee was not merely an educational institution, it was a political intermediary. It spoke the language of uplift to Black audiences and the language of stability and order to white benefactors. This dual role gave Tuskegee extraordinary influence, but it also imposed structural constraints. As historian James D. Anderson notes, Tuskegee's model for funding depended on continuous white approval, including donations from Northern philanthropists and cooperation with Southern officials. Its leadership learned that survival required caution, diplomacy, and institutional restraint. This created a paradox. Tuskegee was one of the most powerful Black institutions in the United States, yet it lacked genuine autonomy. Its leadership could advocate for Black advancement only within boundaries deemed acceptable by white patrons. Open resistance to segregation, federal authority, or medical institutions risked funding, partnerships, and political retaliation. This institutional posture did not mean Tuskegee's leaders lacked concern for their communities. Rather, it meant that their ability to refuse cooperation, especially with federal agencies, presenting themselves as benevolent, was severely limited. By the early 20th century, Tuskegee Institute had become trusted by Black rural populations, respected by white philanthropists, and was considered legible to federal agencies as a stable, cooperative partner. When government researchers later sought access to poor Black communities for medical research, Tuskegee's name carried instant legitimacy. The Institute's reputation, carefully cultivated through decades of accommodation, would help transform what should have been greeted with skepticism into something that appeared educational, charitable, and safe. Tuskegee's success was real, but that success, well, it came with strings. And those strings would quietly shape one of the most devastating ethical failures in American medical history. The Rosenwald Fund fundamentally shaped Tuskegee's development, and later the context for the syphilis study. Julius Rosenwald, president of Sears, Roebuck and Company, began supporting Booker T. Washington in the early 20th century. In 1917, he formally established the Rosenwald Fund, dedicated to improving Black life in the rural South through education, agricultural development, public health, and housing. Between 1917 and 1932, the fund helped finance over 5,000 Black schools, teacher homes, and vocational facilities. Crucially, Rosenwald Philanthropy operated on a matching funds model, requiring Black communities to raise money locally, deeply embedding trust and cooperation. By the 1920s, funds supported reformers increasingly believed health deficiencies explained racial inequality. Public health researchers, often associated with the U.S. Public Health Service, viewed syphilis as both a medical threat and a social problem. A USPHS report warned, venereal disease weakens not only the individual, but the economic and moral fabric of the community. This framing placed medical intervention above political reform, reinforcing paternalism. When the Great Depression struck, the Rosenwald Fund sharply reduced funding in 1931. This withdrawal did not end existing studies, it reshaped them. As Susan Reverby notes, Tuskegee's health initiatives became stranded midway between care and control. Macon County was not chosen at random. By the early 20th century, Macon County represented one of the clearest examples of how race, poverty, and power operated together in the rural South. At the time the study was conceived, over 80% of Macon County's population was African American. Despite this overwhelming majority, nearly all political and economic power remained in the hands of white citizens. Black residents were systematically excluded from voting through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation, leaving them with no meaningful influence over county policy or public resources. Historian Alan Brandt argues that this combination, numerical dominance without political power, created ideal conditions for exploitation, particularly by state and federal authorities who faced little risk of local resistance. The vast majority of Black families in Macon County lived as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, tied to white landowners through a system of debt that historians have described as a form of economic peonage. Under the crop lien system, families borrowed supplies at the beginning of the year and paid excessive interest, and only settled accounts after the harvest, often still in debt. As a result, families had little mobility, minimal savings, and no financial margin for medical care. James H. Jones notes that illness in this system was not simply a health problem. It was an economic catastrophe, threatening eviction or starvation. Housing for most Black families consisted of small, overcrowded cabins with dirt floors, poor ventilation, and limited access to clean water. Malnutrition was common, and infectious diseases, including tuberculosis, hookworm, and syphilis, were widespread. Public health surveys conducted in the 1910s and 1920s consistently portrayed Macon County as suffering from, and I quote, deplorable sanitary conditions. Though these reports largely ignored the structural causes of those conditions, such as land ownership patterns and racial segregation. Healthcare access in Macon County was minimal to non-existent. There was no hospital available to Black residents for much of the early 20th century. Few Black physicians practiced in the county, and white physicians rarely treated Black patients except in extreme emergencies. For many families, the nearest doctor was miles away and entirely unaffordable. Jones emphasizes that many study participants had never been examined by a physician before enrolling. In this context, medicine was experienced not as a system of rights or standards, but as sporadic charity, delivered when and how authorities saw fit. When the U.S. Public Health Service arrived offering physical examinations, transportation to the treatment, hot meals, and burial insurance, It did not appear exploitive. It appeared generous. Alan Brandt notes that federal researchers were perceived as representatives of modern science and government authority, possessing both expertise and legitimacy. The imbalance of knowledge and power made meaningful consent impossible. Perhaps most crucially, Tuskegee Institute sat physically within Macon County. For Black residents, Tuskegee was a source of pride, a center of education and opportunity for the Black community, and a rare Black controlled institution with national prestige. When the study was presented in association with Tuskegee, it carried enormous credibility. As Susan Reverby explains, the Institute's presence legitimized the study in the eyes of the community, even when the benefits were illusory. Trust, earned through decades of Black labor, education, and aspiration, became the study's most valuable asset. Macon County offered federal researchers a stable and immobile population, extreme medical need, minimal risk of political or legal resistance, and institutional cover through Tuskegee Institute. In other words, it offered access without accountability. Or as James H. Jones bluntly concludes, Macon County provided the perfect setting for a study that required dependency, silence, and time. After Washington's death in 1915, Robert Moton assumed leadership. Moton faced declining philanthropic resources, heightened scrutiny from white elites, and growing federal interest in Southern public health. Unlike Washington, Moton lacked deep personal ties to donors and relied heavily on institutional cooperation. Jones observes that Moton viewed federal partnerships as necessary concessions in a hostile environment. When public health service researchers proposed syphilis studies in the 1920s, Moton agreed to limited cooperation, believing it would bring resources and recognition to Tuskegee. This decision entangled Tuskegee in the study's authority without granting it real power. By the late 1920s, syphilis was a recognized public health crisis, but treatment options were both limited and dangerous. Standard therapy relied on mercury rubs, bismuth injections, and arsenical compounds such as salvarsan. These treatments were lengthy, painful, and often toxic. Patients endured months or even years of therapy with side effects including kidney damage, neurological injury, and in some cases, death. A Journal of the American Medical Association review in 1929 conceded openly the prolonged administration of mercury and arsenicals often proves injurious and occasionally fatal. Yet, despite these dangers, treatment was still considered ethically obligatory. The prevailing medical consensus held that some attempt at therapy was at least better than none, particularly once a diagnosis had been made. The initial conception of the Macon County project followed a progressive era public health model. They would screen populations for disease, provide available treatment, and track outcomes over time. This model aligned with Rosenwald Fund goals and justified Tuskegee Institute's early cooperation. Treatment, however imperfect, remained central to the program's legitimacy. Everything changed in 1931. The Great Depression forced the Rosenwald Fund to withdraw from many of its public health commitments, including those in Macon County. This sudden loss of funding eliminated the resources necessary for prolonged treatment programs, transportation, and follow-up care. At this point, ethical responsibility required ending the project, or at least securing alternative funding. Instead, public health service physicians Taliaferro Clark and Raymond Vandelaire chose a different path. Faced with untreated patients and no money, Clark and Vandelaire reconceptualized the situation as a unique scientific opportunity. They argued that Macon County offered a large cohort of infected men, limited prior treatment exposure, stable living conditions, and little risk of outside medical intervention. In internal communications and later publications, untreated syphilis was portrayed not as a tragedy, but as a naturally occurring laboratory. One public health service report explained, "The present situation affords an unusual opportunity for observing the effects of untreated syphilis over a long period of time." This moment marks what James J. Jones famously describes as the study's ethical rupture. Prior to 1931, neglect could at least be attributed to inadequate resources and ineffective medicine. After 1931, withholding care became intentional. Clark and Vandelaire did not simply fail to treat. They designed a study around non-treatment, creating a protocol that required men remain untreated for years and eventually decades. As Jones writes, the decision to observe rather than treat transformed a poorly funded health program into a morally indefensible experiment. Crucially, this shift also changed how the men themselves were viewed. They were no longer patients in need of care. They became research subjects, valued primarily for what their bodies could reveal over time. The fact that the men were poor, Black, medically underserved, and politically powerless was not incidental. It was essential to the experiment's survival. Everything that followed, the deception, the exclusion from penicillin, the decades of silence, rests on this decision. Tuskegee did not begin with a lie. It began with a choice. In 1932, what had once been a loosely organized public health effort was formally transformed into a structured medical experiment known internally as the study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. That title alone reveals the study's governing assumption. The absence of treatment was not a problem to be solved. It was the condition under investigation. The Public Health Service formally enrolled 399 African American men diagnosed with syphilis. and 201 African American men without syphilis, designated as a control group. None of the men were informed of their diagnosis. This is important that we keep in mind. None of them. Instead, participants were told they suffered from bad blood, a vague local term that could refer to fatigue, anemia, or general illness. The phrase was intentionally chosen for its ambiguity and cultural familiarity. As Alan Brandt notes, the use of bad blood allowed researchers to communicate without informing, preserving cooperation while avoiding informed consent. In professional publications, the men were described not as patients, but as research material. A 1934 study report explained these subjects represented an unusual opportunity for observing the natural course of syphilis, uninfluenced by treatment. The phrasing is striking. Suffering is rendered invisible. Poverty is irrelevant. What mattered was opportunity. Participants were subjected to repeated physical examinations, blood tests, and most notably, lumbar punctures, also known as spinal taps. At the time, spinal taps were painful and carried medical risk. They were performed not for the benefit of the patient, but to detect neurological damage caused by tertiary syphilis. To secure compliance, researchers described these procedures as special treatments or tests necessary to help them get well. James H. Jones documents that men were even told spinal taps were required to qualify for burial insurance, further coercing their participation. The study provided free meals on examination days, transportation to clinics, medical attention otherwise unavailable, and then promises of burial insurance. In Macon County's economic conditions, these were powerful incentives. But these benefits were offered without disclosure of risk, diagnosis, or alternatives. As Susan Reverby emphasizes, this was not consent. It was managed dependency. Local trust was reinforced through the involvement of Dr. Eugene Dibble, a respected Black physician, and Nurse Eunice Rivers, whose consistent presence over decades created personal bonds with participants. While Rivers, a Black nurse, believed she was helping the men access care, she operated under strict federal direction and was never empowered to alter the study or inform participants of the truth. Her role illustrates what Reverby calls the moral ambiguity of constrained agency within racist systems. It is sometimes argued that informed consent standards did not exist in the 1930s. And to be fair, this is a bit misleading. By the early 20th century, medical ethics codes emphasized voluntary participation. Deception in experimentation was controversial, and physicians clearly distinguished between treatment and research. James H. Jones stresses that the key issue is not the absence of formal consent doctrine, but the presence of deliberate deception. Consent was not ignored because it was unknown. It was ignored because it would have ended the study. Between 1932 and 1936, deception became standard practice. False explanations were repeated. Misrepresentations were documented. Professional publications omitted any discussion of ethics. By 1936, the study was no longer a temporary measure. It had become institutional routine. As one later internal memo admitted, the continuation of the study depends on maintenance of the status quo. This phase of the Tuskegee study marks the moment when deception became systemic. Subjects became data, and ethics were subordinated to publication. Nothing that followed was accidental. The men were not forgotten, they were watched. By 1936, the Tuskegee study had moved well beyond casual observation. The U.S. Public Health Service began publishing formal reports in scientific outlets documenting the course of untreated syphilis in the study population. One such publication, appearing in the Journal of Venereal Disease Information, described what researchers were seeing. Late syphilis manifestations were observed with marked frequency among the untreated cohort. This sentence may appear clinical, but it masks profound human suffering. Late manifestations included severe neurological damage, cardiovascular lesions, loss of vision, and progressive debilitation. The study was revealing data about the destructive effects of tertiary syphilis, but not in the way the men themselves understood or were told. By the mid 1930s, some physicians and public health observers began to question the ethics of following untreated disease long term. These critiques were not yet widespread or even public, but internal skepticism did exist within medical circles. Despite this, the Public Health Service firmly rejected ethical concerns. Instead of revising or ending the study, officials made a momentous policy decision. Participants would be followed until death. A September 1936 USPHS memo, which was later archived in federal records, explicitly stated that the only way to obtain complete pathological records was to observe participants through the full course of disease progression, right up until death and autopsy. This shift formalized what historians describe as the enrichment of non-treatment as policy, not just as accidental consequence. Where earlier neglect stemmed from lack of funding or ineffective therapies, after 1936, the absence of care was protocol. Scientific publishing reinforced this orientation. Researchers presented longitudinal data on syphilitic progression, Control and infected groups were compared, even as the subject's health worsened. Findings about neurological decline, cardiovascular lesions, and other damage were framed as valuable contributions to medical literature. What mattered most to the study's architects was data completeness, not human well being. This is an important shift. Scientific incentives rewarded observation of disease progression, not the ethical care of research subjects. The policy hardened even further in the early 1940s when World War II introduced new pressures. As men of study age entered the draft, their medical examinations for military service would have uncovered syphilis, and under standard practice, they would have been referred for treatment. But the Public Health Service acted to block this from happening. In 1941, when selective service boards began testing registrants for venereal disease, U.S. PHS officials reached out to local health authorities to secure exemptions for study participants so they would not be treated or removed from the study. A 1942 exchange of letters between R.A. Vondeleur, a senior USPH official, and county health authorities shows this very clearly. Vondeleur wrote, "I would suggest that you confer with the chairman of the local selective service board to inform him of all the circumstances connected with the study. It is entirely probable he will cooperate with you in the completion of the investigation." In other words, federal officials worked to ensure subjects remained untreated, even as systemic screening threatened to expose their disease. This was not passive negligence. It was active engineering of non-treatment. Importantly, this period also saw the broader medical community largely accept the study without public censor. There were no formal ethical sanctions from professional associations. Academic journals continued to publish findings. The narrative of natural history science went largely unchallenged. Historians have interpreted this as a product of racial bias in mainstream medicine, a scientific culture indifferent to informed consent, and a structural exclusion of Black voices in professional and medical ethics forums. The core contradiction was never addressed. How can a study that withholds known beneficial care be justified scientifically? During this period, that question was systematically avoided. Between 1936 and 1945, the Tuskegee study ceased to be a poorly funded public health program and became a scientific institution with its own inertia. Non-treatment was written into protocol. Scientific prestige helped shield the study from criticism. Federal agencies coordinated to prevent participants from obtaining external care, and ethical questions were dismissed rather than debated. This set the stage for the even more egregious decisions that followed in the post-war era, especially after penicillin became available as a proven cure. By the end of World War II, the medical landscape of syphilis treatment had fundamentally changed. In the early 1940s, Scientists rediscovered penicillin's remarkable effectiveness against the bacterium that causes syphilis. In 1943, the U.S. government passed the Henderson Act, which required federally funded clinics to provide testing and treatment for venereal diseases. Within just a few years, penicillin was widely distributed to both military and civilian populations as a safe, effective cure for all stages of syphilis. By 1945 to 1947, penicillin had become the standard treatment of choice, supplanting the hazardous mercury, arsenic, and bismuth therapies that had previously dominated clinical practice. A 1947 Public Health Service bulletin declared penicillin is now the drug of choice for the treatment of syphilis in all stages, underscoring its dramatic impact on disease outcomes nationwide. For most Americans, this meant that early stage infection was no longer a life sentence, it was curable. But for the men of the Tuskegee study, this scientific breakthrough did not translate into care. Despite federal distribution of penicillin through newly established rapid treatment centers, the study's infected participants were deliberately excluded from receiving the cure. Researchers did not simply fail to offer penicillin, they withheld information about its availability and set up barriers to treatment. Evidence from contemporaneous public health correspondence shows that study officials worked to keep subjects out of local treatment programs that provided penicillin to other patients in Macon County and also the surrounding areas. In some cases, research staff instructed local physicians and health departments not to treat participants in order to preserve the natural history data the study was designed to collect. This was not passive inaction. It was an active intervention to deny care, and it reshaped the purpose of the study. Where the research had once been justified, however poorly you tried to justify it, as a public health observation, it now explicitly depended on sustained non-treatment despite the fact that there was available safe therapy for them. In the words of historian Susan Reverby, at this point, the study could only be justified by ignoring the humanity of its subjects. Her analysis highlights how policy and prejudice had overtaken medical ethics, turning the experiment into an instrumentation of harm rather than inquiry. To justify continued non-treatment, some USPH investigators advanced rationalizations that were not supported by evidence. One idea circulating among researchers was that penicillin, when administered to someone with long-standing latent syphilis, might cause reactions, Herxheimer reactions, a rapid inflammatory response to dying bacteria, and therefore it might be dangerous. This was an unfounded concern rooted more in conjecture than sound clinical practice. Others argued that the men would never seek treatment on their own, or that they were too, and I quote, stoic to adhere to a treatment regimen, an argument that rested on racial stereotypes rather than empirical evidence. But these rationalizations obscured the fundamental fact. A highly effective, low risk cure existed, and it was being deliberately withheld. The decision to exclude study participants from penicillin is a key moment in the ethical collapse of the Tuskegee study. It transformed a poorly conceived research project into a purposeful system of harm. It revealed that the study was no longer satisfied with observation alone. It required non treatment as a condition of its survival. It made clear that scientific goals were being placed above human well being, even after a cure existed. In the words of critics and historians alike, this was not neglect, it was a choice. After World War II, the Tuskegee study entered its longest and most insidious phase, not because of dramatic new decisions, but because of institutional inertia. By the late 1940s, the study had survived multiple scientific revolutions: the collapse of mercury based treatments, the rise of penicillin as a cure, and the growing international movement toward research ethics following the Nuremberg trials. Yet, the Tuskegee study persisted, embedded within the routine operations of federal public health bureaucracy. From 1947 to 1962, the study became a training site. According to James H. Jones, at least 127 Black medical students, many from historically Black medical schools, rotated through the Tuskegee program during this period. These students were not hidden from the truth and nature of the study. It was openly discussed, cited in lectures, and treated as legitimate public health research. Jones notes that for many trainees, the study appeared not as a moral dilemma, but as an established fact of medical life. This normalization mattered. The study was no longer dependent on a small group of original architects. Instead, it was sustained by generations of professionals who inherited it as routine. Importantly, the presence of Black medical professionals did not function as a safeguard. Their involvement was frequently cited internally as evidence that the study could not be racist or unethical. Historian Susan Reverby observes that this dynamic allowed white administrators to deflect moral responsibility by pointing to Black participation, even though ultimate authority always remained with the U.S. Public Health Service. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, data from the study continued to appear in medical journals. The men were still referred to as subjects, the absence of treatment still justified as scientifically necessary. What changed was medical ethics everywhere else. By this time, informed consent standards were emerging. Human subject protections were expanding. The NIH was moving toward formal review boards. Yet, none of these evolving norms were applied retroactively to Tuskegee. The study existed in a moral exemption zone, protected by its longevity and institutional prestige. As Jones writes, the longer the study continued, the harder it became for anyone within the system to imagine stopping it. In 1968, the first sustained ethical challenge came not from within medicine, but from a public health investigator named Peter Buxton. Buxton, a former venereal disease interviewer for the Public Health Service, learned of the study while working in San Francisco. He submitted a formal letter questioning its ethics, arguing that the continued non treatment of subjects violated basic principles of medical responsibility. His objections were not fringe or radical. By 1968, penicillin had been standard for over 20 years, and informed consent had become a widely accepted expectation. Buxton explicitly raised concerns about deception, racial targeting, and preventable harm. The response was silence. His concerns were passed through internal channels and eventually forwarded to the Centers for Disease Control, which had absorbed responsibility for the study. No corrective action was taken. In February of 1969, the CDC convened an internal review panel to evaluate whether the study should continue. The outcome was unequivocal. The study should proceed. The panel concluded that the data were still unique and that the study had already gone on too long to terminate. The men, now aging and increasingly ill, were reframed as too late to save. The CDC's decision was reinforced by external validation. Both local chapters of the American Medical Association and the National Medical Association, the latter representing Black physicians, formally supported the continuation of the study. This moment is critical. It demonstrates that the study did not persist due to ignorance. It persisted because institutional loyalty outweighed ethical responsibility. Professional organizations deferred to federal authority. Federal agencies deferred to tradition. No single actor claimed responsibility, but the harm continued. Susan Reverby characterizes this period as one of ethical diffusion, where, as she writes, no one felt responsibility because everyone was involved. By the late 1960s, the Tuskegee study survived not because its defenders believed it was good, but because stopping it would have required admitting wrongdoing, dismantling professional authority, and acknowledging racial injustice within federal medicine. Silence became policy. Continuation became default. It would take public exposure, not internal review, to finally end the study. And that exposure was still 3 years away. The Tuskegee study did not end because its architects had a change of heart. It ended because the public finally found out. In July of 1972, Associated Press journalist Jean Heller broke the story that would finally bring the Tuskegee study to national attention. Her reporting revealed that for 40 years, the U.S. government had knowingly allowed Black men with syphilis to go untreated, even after an effective cure became widely available. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Newspapers across the country condemned the study. Editorials described it as government-sponsored human experimentation. Civil rights organizations demanded answers. For many Americans, the story confirmed longstanding fears that Black communities were being used as test subjects under the guise of public health. James H. Jones writes that the speed of the response reflected how dramatically public norms had shifted. He writes in his book Bad Blood, practices once considered unfortunate but acceptable were now clearly recognized as immoral. Within months of the story's publication, the study was terminated. Later in 1972 and into 1973, Congress convened hearings to investigate the study's origins, methods, and consequences. Testimony revealed what internal reviews had failed to confront. Participants were never informed they had syphilis. Treatment was deliberately withheld, and consent was neither sought nor documented. The hearings also exposed how many layers of government had known about the study and allowed it to continue, spanning the Public Health Service, the CDC, and local medical institutions. Yet the hearings stopped short of criminal accountability. No individual researchers were prosecuted. No officials were formally disciplined. Responsibility dissolved into institutional language, policies, procedures, historical context. In 1973, attorney Fred Gray, already known for representing Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the study's participants and their families. The suit alleged deception, violation of constitutional rights, and reckless disregard for human life. Rather than proceed to trial, the federal government opted for settlement. In 1974, an out-of-court agreement awarded approximately $10 million in compensation. Survivors received limited financial payments, and the government agreed to provide lifetime medical care and burial benefits for living participants. That agreement created the Tuskegee Health Benefit Program, administered by the Department of Health and Human Services. Crucially, the settlement did not include an admission of legal wrongdoing. Over time, it became impossible to ignore the study's broader impact. In 1975, eligibility for the Tuskegee Health Benefit Program was expanded to include wives, widows, and children affected by congenital syphilis. This expansion quietly acknowledged what had long been denied. The study had harmed not only individual men, but entire families across generations. In 1995, the program was expanded again to include general health benefits, recognizing that decades of neglect had contributed to far more than syphilis related illness. Even so, compensation remained limited, and many affected families never received meaningful restitution. On May 16, 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the United States government. In a White House ceremony attended by surviving participants and their families, Clinton stated, "What the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry." He acknowledged that the study was racist, unethical, and a betrayal of public trust. He also recognized the damage it had done to Black families and their faith in medicine, a mistrust that continues to shape health outcomes to this day. But the apology came 65 years after the study began, and 25 years after it was exposed. Only a handful of original participants were still alive to hear Clinton's words. The apology marked an important symbolic moment, but it was not closure. No researchers lost license. No institutions issued formal confessions. No comprehensive reparations were enacted. And as Susan Reverby argues, the Tuskegee study became a cautionary tale often invoked in ethics training, but rarely examined as a structural failure of American medicine. The danger, she warns, is that Tuskegee is remembered as an aberration rather than as a predictable outcome of racial hierarchy, professional insulation, and bureaucratic self-protection. The end of the Tuskegee study did not represent justice. It represented exposure. It revealed that ethical reform in American medicine did not come from within, but from public outrage, journalistic scrutiny, and legal pressure. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study is often described as a turning point. That framing is true, but incomplete. In the immediate aftermath of Tuskegee's exposure, the U.S. government moved quickly to repair its image and its research infrastructure. In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act, which mandated oversight of all federally funded research involving human subjects. This led to the creation of the institutional review boards, the formal requirement of informed consent, the development of the Belmont Report in 1979, which articulated three core principles: respect for persons, benevolence, and justice. Each of these principles maps directly on to what Tuskegee violated. As historians have noted, modern research ethics in the United States were not born from abstract moral reasoning, but from public embarrassment and documented abuse. The study left a deeper scar, one that cannot be legislated away. Multiple public health studies have shown persistent mistrust of medical institutions among African Americans, often explicitly linked to Tuskegee. While mistrust predates the study, Tuskegee became its most visible symbol. Susan Reverby cautions against oversimplification here. Tuskegee did not create mistrust, it confirmed it. Importantly, she and others warn that invoking Tuskegee as a catch all explanation for disparities can obscure ongoing structural inequalities, unequal access, biased care, underrepresentation in trials that still remain unresolved. Perhaps the most dangerous misunderstanding of Tuskegee is the belief that it was an anomaly. The study involved major medical journals. It was supported by professional organizations. It persisted across multiple administrations, and it survived in scientific consensus. It was not the product of a few rogue doctors. It was the product of a system that prioritized data over dignity, protected institutions over individuals, and assumed that poor Black lives were expendable for greater knowledge. Tuskegee is now taught in ethics classes, cited in consent forms, and referenced in public discourse. But remembrance without reckoning is insufficient. The study forces some very uncomfortable questions. Who decides when harm is acceptable? Who gets protected by ethics? And who gets studied? And how often does silence masquerade as neutrality? Tuskegee reminds us that science does not drift towards justice on its own. It moves only when power, scrutiny, and accountability force it to. And that may be its most enduring lesson. This has been the History Podcast. I'm Jason Thomason. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.